We have three panelists today. Scott Miller, our lead panelist, is the Chief Information Security Officer at Mr. Cooper. Benita Bashan is the President and Enterprise Architect at Pontus Research. And Keith Squires is the President and CEO at Pathmaker Group. We call this our Identity and Access Management Services Partner Alliance. Pathmaker Group, Pontus Research, and Secure IT have been working in this space for many, many years and have deep levels of expertise in identity and access management. That has been our focus from the founding of each of the companies. There's a wealth of knowledge, experience, and coverage across the United States. Pathmaker Group tends to focus on the middle of the United States. Pontus Research on the West Coast and in the Northeast. And Secure IT tends to focus on the Southeast plus European coverage.
Thank you, Katie, and welcome everyone. We have a large group today. We've been doing these webinars really since COVID started, and attendance continues to increase and improve. So we appreciate those who joined, and I know we've got some repeat attendees as well, and that's always good to see. So hopefully we're providing some value through this process. We've gotten to know a lot of people, and I think it's been a very good interaction. So today, I just want to say welcome again, and also want to say welcome to Scott Miller, who is so graciously volunteered to contribute some of his time today. Scott and I go way back to, gosh, I don't know, Scott, 03 or 04 or
yeah. It's It's
been a while.
It's been since close to when your company was starting up and your focus was almost purely identity management.
Right.
Before you had blown up into everything. So it's been a long time.
Well, once again, we appreciate Scott. Consider Scott a good friend and a client now too. So we've asked him to share some of his experiences of working in this space over the years. Obviously, Scott has a much bigger role than just identity, but this has been a key part of his focus as well. So let's just start and let's talk about why should you build a roadmap? There's been a lot of interest in this topic, clearly by the registrations, but just in discussions with our clients, it seems like everybody has come to a place where they're starting to understand it's important to go into kind of a long-term view of these things you have to do with identity. And as much as you don't want to think about it this way, we've heard a lot of people describe IAM as more like an ERP implementation instead of just some security tool that you put in place and then monitor and run. So given that idea that this is a little bit more like a long-term program, what are the reasons you need to build a roadmap? And if you have some ideas to contribute or you have a question about why should we, feel free to drop it in the chat or the Q&A as we go along here. But let me just offer a few ideas. And one on the list is, in this environment today with security professionals, everybody seems to have 1, 2, 3 or more jobs on their plate. And the day-to-day and the urgency and the firefighting is intense, and we see that all the time with our clients. So how do you carve out and make room for what's important long-term? The strategic stuff may not be as urgent as what's right on your plate, but it's still really important to get a grip on that so that you can see long-term improvement over time on things that are foundational and improvement and need improvement. So part of that is let's get it on a roadmap and let's make sure and prioritize accordingly. Another idea is just improving alignment of your key stakeholders. Everybody really needs to know where you're headed, why you're doing this, what the buy-in would be long-term. Really, how do you make sure everybody's on the same page when it comes to looking at your long-term program? So a roadmap and getting that process in place and the steps you go through is a great way to align your stakeholders. As you do that, educating people on what you can do with IAM is a good benefit that comes out of that process. So many people who are going to be impacted by IAM or maybe need to be involved in funding or helping sort out priorities, they need to really understand what's available, what you can do for your organization, how you can use it strategically, things like that. So education is a good benefit coming out of this. And then Benita, feel free to chime in here, but I know you've had a lot of experiences with customer IAM and the need to make sure that those stakeholders are aligned because there's a lot of variability in the experience on the customer side of IAM with organizations?
I think the biggest thing to remember is most customer IAM programs are managed by the business as part of a digital transformation. It's usually the teams that are interested in developing relationships with their consumers or their customers. So it's a slightly different group that's driving the SIAM experience, or the consumer identity and access management experience. So there is, while enterprise IAM, you've got your contracts with your employees and your contractors and your vendors. With consumers, their experience becomes critical because it's very easy for them to come to you. But if they don't like what they see or how quickly things are happening, off they go to someone else. And with the pandemic, a lot of people, there's a lot of e-commerce, everyone's shopping from home. So it's really important, if you're in retail, manufacturing, wherever you are, that you make the customer experience as seamless and as without overhead as possible.
Right.
At the same time, you've got your branding and your security issues that you have to manage as an organization. So it's sort of balancing all of this that makes this challenging.
And we have seen an increase in the need for CIAM in this industry we're in, and they're turning to the enterprise folks because they understand IAM at a level that many of the, the business teams, marketing teams have really never had to deal with. So, one more benefit just to move along here is standardization across your enterprise for how to do IAM, and getting that alignment among enterprise architecture and other technologists within your organization. And Scott, I want to just bring you in real quick here on stakeholders, because I know when we went through this process with you, you cast a really wide net. We had a big old room and you had lots of people in there. So can you share just your recommendations and kind of how you were able to cast a wide net and get the participation you did?
Yeah, certainly. So the catalyst for this, unfortunately, but interestingly enough, was in audit finding. However, it's important to differentiate between the audit finding specifically calling out, saying that you needed an identity and access management system, of which we already had, versus me leveraging an audit finding to move forward with replacing an identity and access management system. And so what I essentially did was I leveraged this opportunity to address an audit finding by first starting out by indicating we need a roadmap and we need input into this roadmap. And this is an enterprise level function. It is an enterprise level issue. And so that being said, you don't want to have people who are trying to decide the fate in the future for the entirety of the company by not having input into this, by not being, having the opportunity to say, yes, I'm going to lead the company this way or lead the company that way. So it was almost a FOMO type thing, right? I wanted to make this a fear of missing out for several people so that they had the impetus and the motivation to be part of the solution rather than have the solution force them down a certain path. Exactly. So I sold it as that with my peers. And so the good thing is, being at a senior level in the company, I get to have the connections to the right people at the right levels and garner the right levels of interest, because the people that I am at from a peer perspective are focused on the biggest picture. So that was one part of it. The second part of it was, again, the messaging, shooting out the communication to my peers and my team members to say, hey, listen, we've got a big, hairy goal to address this audit finding. And the best way we can do this is with a solution that is living in this space. This is the most important beginning project that we can begin for the program of revamping information security for this entire institution. So let's start by gathering the right people and getting your minds set for being part of information security as a program, not just this as a project.
Good.
I really sold it big.
Excellent. Thank you for that, Scott. Appreciate it. Katie, let's go ahead and move on. So let's talk about, some steps here. And developing a roadmap is not unique to IAM, clearly. There's a lot of ways to kind of walk through this process. Here's a suggestion on some steps. So we've been doing this process for many years, and we've kind of honed it down to a process that works well. And we'll walk through and kind of describe some of this, but we're going to call out and describe some of the things that make a roadmap for IAM somewhat unique, and we'll do that along this curvy road here. I wish it wasn't so curvy, but that's more of a reflection of reality, probably, in this process, and Scott can probably identify with it. But let's just look at the steps briefly, and then we'll get into the details. So the first step, prepare, right? You really got to make sure you know who you want to involve. Not only that, but what's the scope of this going to include? And then how long you want to spend on it. So we'll talk about all those topics. You can go crazy or you can be real right-sized here. So that's important to just step back and think about it before you jump into it. Second, it'd just be discovery. So how are you going to get your arms around really what's going on today and where you're at and where are the issues, and do we agree that this is a problem? If not, why not? Let's discuss, debate this type of thing. Let's just get in and see what's there. Let's stir up all the dust and find out what we've got in front of us. So discovery. The third step, analysis. We'll look at all the things that came out of that and just kind of look at, hey, there's some short-term stuff here, there's some long-term stuff here. Where should we land in all this data that we've gathered? And we need to compile it in such a way that we can then kind of get into the fourth step, which is planning. How do we put it all in an order? How do we decide what's more important than other things? How do we really put our arms around the estimating of how long this should take? How are we going to schedule it? How do we make sure we're looking at conflicting priorities potentially? Things like that. So this is our steps. This doesn't mean you have to do it this way, but it's an option that we believe works well. So let's get into this in a little more detail. And we'll start with the preparation. And Vanita, I'm going to kick it over to you. Katie, if you want to move ahead one slide. There you go. Vanita, I'll let you kind of walk through this for us.
Thank you, Keith, and welcome everyone. So what I wanted to do, because in the interest of time, I want to jump straight in, is, okay, everyone's talking about an IAM roadmap. What is it? Is it just a checkbox that you want to show your, C-suite that you've done due diligence, or is it something you really want to do? That's a first step. If you decide it's something you want to do, what are the things you should do? As Keith mentioned, scope it, because you can try to solve world hunger with identity and access. Remember, because identity is the entrance into your company. Whatever company you have, whether it's a consumer or a user, that's the first entry point where they provide you information about themselves, and you decide, have they already registered? Have they been onboarded? So all of this stems and starts with the identity, and you're authenticating that identity. So you could say everything could be included in the scope, and that's what you don't want to do. You want to know, what is it that you're going to look at within the scope of this roadmap? Is it going to be identity provisioning? Is it going to be the governance of the identities? Is it going to be authentication and authorization, auditing? You can take a few buckets and decide, this is the scope of my roadmap. And typically decide, how are you going to do this? Are you going to do a high-level roadmap that covers everything? Or are you going to go in depth, in detail, and focus on one specific area? So your roadmap, the scope, is what decides how successful you're going to be. Make it too big, and it's going to be all over the place. Make it too small, and it's probably going to be pointless. So the scope is really, really important. Are you going to include identity and access of just the enterprise? Are you going to include your consumers? All of this needs to be thought through. Once you've decided what the scope is, you kind of know who are the people who are impacted by this scope of activities, right? Is it your CISO? Is it your business teams? Is it the VP of digital transformation? Who is it at the top level? And then you work through, is it HR, legal, compliance? In fact, we're right now doing an assessment with an organization, and we've been meeting legal, compliance, HR, their external teams. It's just a big group of people. You can put them all in a room or you can have separate meetings. But the point is, know who your stakeholders are going to be and what the value is to them, because that's important. When you bring stakeholders into a room, know why they're being brought into the room. Why are they impacted? Are they people who approve your funding? Are they the people that will give you executive support? Not only do you just decide you have stakeholders, and I think Scott brought that up, spread your net wide so that everybody is involved and understands what you're doing. So the roadmap is not just IT building a little roadmap, it's everybody putting their might behind the success of this roadmap. And then again, what's your planning cycle? Are you going to stop and say, look, I'm just going to do this for a month. I'm going to be date driven. So my program is going to start on this date and end on this date. Am I going to look at this as I have this bucket of money? That's what I need to spend. And please don't do that, right? That was just a bad example. But really the goal is look at your planning cycle. What is it that works for you? So when you get this roadmap, you have an understanding of how to phase things. Katie, can we move to the next slide, please? So we've talked about scope, stakeholders, and the planning cycle. And then once you do this, what are you trying to do? You are looking to see where you stand across the key areas. And if you look at Gartner or Forrester or any of the analysts, they usually have a scoring method for IAM maturity. And it's pretty much the same as what you're seeing here. They'll have different names for it. But really, no company that I've done this for, and I've been doing this for about 20 odd years, has come out in any one clean pillar. Everybody's sort of, in some areas, they are very ad hoc. In some areas, they haven't even thought about it. In some areas, they do have a project, but that project team doesn't talk to anybody else. So I've got an SSO project and I've got a provisioning project. Do you think those two people talk to each other? Nope, they're different people. And the guy that does the ping solution is not really talking to the person that does the SailPoint provisioning solution. So there you've got silos. And then you've got companies where they've started putting documented processes where they're going across the board in certain areas. There you have sort of a managed approach. And then you've got the optimized, which, to put it bluntly, is the nirvana of all IAM programs. You want to be there. So really the goal is, first of all, look at where you are from a maturity standpoint. I think, Keith, now you were going to talk about I know you love this area, so I'm going to get back to you.
We'll get into assessment
and analysis.
Yeah, before we move on, I just wanted to ask Scott, you had in your mind, Scott, when you did your initial assessment, how long you wanted it to take. You were a little bit, behind the eight ball time-wise, but what would you recommend for people think about when you decide, okay, do we want to make this take a week, a month, 6 months? What's the key criteria here?
Yeah, I would say that the key criteria is the scoping, and then figuring out what your small wins are going to be so that you are only as far back as what you have committed to, right? Mm-hmm. The old concept of under promise and over deliver is definitely where people should go with this. Yeah. Start with something small, but something meaningful. And so when you look at, how long you think that any one of these projects is going to take, there is no such thing as putting any identity and access management system in place and having it fully effective, not for just a specific component, right? Because anybody can put something in just to solve one particular problem, but to put an IDM product in place and establish the program, it really is like doing an ERP, but it's in the security spectrum, right? Just like putting a governance, risk, and compliance program in place is like doing an ERP. So you're looking at 3 to 5 years easily for any fully fledged identity and access management program. A product, maybe you can shove a product in there very quickly, but to have that product have the effect on the entire enterprise the way that you want it to, you're really going to, these are the reasons for the roadmap. And this is a reason why when you look at the maturity model, you're going to have to start looking at how you're going to progress along that timeline and that model.
Yeah.
Great. Thank you, Scott. So Katie, let's move ahead and let's talk about discovery. And really this is, it's all around assessing and kind of measuring and comparing where we're at today and where do we need to be. So click forward one more. Assessment, you can use the word assessment. Let's start and get a baseline and decide, where are we at today? How bad are the problems? And how do you do that? Well, you've got to measure it against something. So you have to have some kind of standard, and there's a lot of different ways to do this. We have a method. Benita has a method. Most IAM large consulting companies have some kind of process. Ours tends to lean towards the kind of lean rapid method, but it's still meaningful and thorough enough to cover all your bases. But you got to compare it. So you do a measurement, you compare it to some standard, some best practice, some goal, and then you look at those gaps. So it's those gaps that will inform you, about how much work you've got to do. And so you need to get through that process and look at, okay, we've got gaps, they represent risk. Where are my big risks? Where are my priorities around these risks? How do I really get my arms around these problems and where we need to go going forward? Let's get this all documented and compiled, and then let's kind of move to the next step. So let's move along to analysis, Katie, and talk about, so here's an example of our assessment, just briefly. We've arranged all these topics in what we call levers, 8 different topic areas. And what it gives you a way to do is align language for the people who you're working with who discuss these things. It's not that this is, the end all or authoritative necessarily, but it is a way to frame data and information and discussions so that everybody can talk about things in the same way. It's a dictionary, so to speak. And we measure 80 data points. So again, there's 200 or 300 or more capabilities, but what are the most critical measurements that are going to indicate maturity, that you've got foundations in place, that you've advanced beyond that? And that's what we measure. So we do a scoring. The stakeholders participate in that. The people who are on the ground working the processes and seeing the issues participate in that. So it's really a way to get a benchmark. Where are we at? And then we look at what a best practice score is and start measuring the difference. So let's go ahead to the discovery section, Katie. We'll talk about this next step, analysis. So assuming you've done an assessment, you've got this compilation of data, what do you do with it? We start talking about how do we close these gaps? And you can decide once you start seeing some of these issues and problems, maybe we need to dig a little bit deeper. Maybe we need to get into understanding all the use cases behind these capabilities. Maybe we need to look at our processes a little deeper, kind of step through where things are broken and understand it at a level that's a little deeper so we can really get to the crux of the matter. We may need to look at, okay, if we know we're going to need some technology changes, what's the impact architecturally of making those switches? What's that going to do to us? You just debate, decide, dig into all that information. You're developing a list of potential action items, kind of a preliminary list. We need to do all these things. Some of them are going to be short-term oriented, where it's not necessarily going to take technology, but maybe it's some process work. Maybe it's just some short, quick projects to get our arms around certain data. Maybe we've never inventoried our applications. Maybe we've never really inventoried our identity attributes and made sure people own those things and understand the flow in the organization. Some of those things are foundational. No matter what you do going forward, you still need to tackle those. We put those in a list called, short-term wins or low-hanging fruit, something like that. And then you got to look at the longer-term things that are going to be more heavy lifting. We have to put a new technology in place to really affect the score. So you're looking at a combination of those things, and you're building that list, and then you're kind of doing some prioritization, some sequencing activities. how are we going to fund this? How are we going to work this, et cetera. So there's a lot that goes on, in both discovering and assessing and then analyzing it and getting it to a point where you can start making decisions and planning. And Scott, I'll just pitch it to you for a second. I know when we went through this process with you, we came up with a long list of lots of things, right? So your advice to the participants, once you have that list of findings and actions that are both short-term and long-term, how do you decide what's your bucket going to be, and how do you arrange it, massage it, decide with your group how to move forward?
I think the first thing you have to do is be honest with yourself and get over the fact that while you thought you may have been a superstar in one area, the reality check shows differently, right? The data shows differently, and I would definitely recommend that once you receive this data, you really do take the time, not by yourself, but with a team of individuals who are really supposed to be committed to this, to sit down, review each of those items step by step so that you can understand them, and then come back to your team and say, this is what was written, this is what the finding was, what does this mean, so that you can take that. So it should not be take it, receive it, create an action plan, and then think that you're going to go about it. This is all really a list of elements that should provide discussion points for you so that you really can create an effective plan.
Gotcha. And Benita, I may have jumped ahead a little bit, but go ahead and let's talk about the planning process based on what Scott's saying, and kind of step through that if you'd like to continue.
Yeah, sure. Katie, do you want to just move to the next slide, please?
Oh, and well, before we go on, it's some examples, right? These are outputs that you would get from our process, and similar to anything else, where you've got, some comparisons, some things that illustrate the issues, some heat maps that show low scores, just some numbers, some numerical data, and all information that helps you absorb and understand where we're at, where we could be, and where are the gaps to getting there. So.
And if you could just go back to that for a moment, I just wanted to mention that the spider diagram on the left side was actually one of the most useful outputs for my entire team, because it was a very good, easy to consume visual representation of where we were weakest, where we were strongest, where where everyone else was in consideration for those same types of areas. So this particular output that we had from a visual perspective was something that was very shareable, right? When you are having conversations with your peers or with the rest of the executive team to explain to them, here are the issues that we're trying to conquer, and here are the weaknesses that we have in our overall program. And then, hey, by the way, we need a plan to address this, which was the whole reason or impetus for doing this.
Great. And Katie, one more forward. Just so, here's just another example, right? You come out with this list of things. Some are tactical, they shouldn't take a long time, but they're still important. They're really high, you'd rank them as high priorities potentially, depending on your organization. And then you've got this list of strategic. And so, that's all going to be very important, relevant input into your planning process. Go ahead, Katie. And again, here's an example. So maybe you need to dive deeper, get into some use cases that support these processes that we're talking about. And do we need to dig into it? Is it a problem? Is it not a problem? Is it a priority or is it not a priority? That's the key thing here. Decide what you need to really dig into to understand maybe at a deeper level what's going on in your enterprise. All right, now your turn, Benita.
No, don't worry. So, we talked about how you've done preparation, you've done discovery, you've analyzed your current environment. What are you doing all this for? You're really doing it, as Scott and Keith pointed out, to get a list of activities, to identify areas for improvement, And then once you've got the two of these things, put it together so you have a ability to put together a plan, which will then take you through the next 1 year, 3 years, 5 years, whatever your planning cycle is, right? And like I said right at the beginning, remember, think about your planning cycle. So you've got all these outputs, you've got all this data, you prioritize it. Now, priorities are kind of interesting. You've got to have a team in there. And I think, Scott, to your point, it cannot be just a small group of people. And I'll give you an example. Recently, I was doing planning with an organization, and we had the IAM folks put their priorities down. And guess what they were? They wanted to, improve the method for the housekeeping tasks. They wanted to make sure that they ran more seamlessly. They had all of these. When we talked to HR, they wanted a better interface when things went wrong. They wanted to have ServiceNow tickets. So everybody's coming in with their different priorities. You've got to sit down, put them all down from your analysis and findings, and then just really sit down and say, okay, is this high for the organization? It's not, is this high just for the team? And then you kind of whittle it down, come up with a list. And that list, as Keith pointed out, you've got your short-term stuff, the tactical improvements that people will go, whoa, this is so much better. And then they'll buy into more stuff because it is, in a sense, a bit of selling at that point. And then you've got the longer-term strategic objectives. And once you come up with that, it's not important to just say, okay, it's in my team. You've got to socialize it. And when you socialize it, you will understand that this team, yes, HR needs to be, whatever you're talking about with HR is definitely a high priority, but they'll come back and say, look, we're rolling out Workday. We're taking out our old system. So we're going to be really busy. So I know it's a high priority for you guys, but you've got to wait till 4 months down the road. So now you've not only got to socialize your plan based on your activities, you've got to make sure that everybody can buy into it, both from a resourcing perspective and a timing perspective, right? And it's all of this put together that finally gives you a roadmap. It's not just, a few people deciding this works for them. It's really taking the time to talk to everyone and understand where their priorities are. So Katie, let's just move on, because there's a point where I think, okay, so this is our definition of a roadmap. So Keith showed you what, they do as part of their assessment. It's the same thing. We look at a roadmap, and when we present it to our clients, what we do is really show them what's working, what are the bits and pieces they already have, what are the bits and pieces that need addressing, and where does it fit on a timeline. And oddly enough, notice our road is also windy. The road is never straight from point A to point B. It's a journey. You are usually somewhere near the beginning of it, and there's always some parts that have started. And there's a story here. Yesterday, I was talking to a gentleman who was telling me that his organization has decided that privileged identity is something they plan to do because it's a quick win, and then they will get to governance. And the key point is, when you're building a roadmap, look at the tasks. It's not, I'm going to check a box and say I've got privileged account management. Next, I'm going to check a box and say I've got governance. You've got to say, I need these bits of governance of your privileged identities, for example, before I do a PAM solution. So you start multiple things, and this roadmap helps you see you can have different projects moving along and delivering to the program. That's very, very important. Katie, can we just move to the next slide, please? So here's a preliminary roadmap, right? And you can see it's got all the tasks, and it says, okay, phase 1, year 1, this is what's going to happen. Year 1, phase 2, this is what's going to happen. So you had all this giant bucket of tasks from your findings. You've taken them, you've prioritized them, and now you're laying them out against a timeline. That's how you're building your roadmap. Do you want to go to the next slide, please? Yeah, so once you've done that and you've got this whole list and you've sort of said phase 1, you've got to lay it out so that people can see what's going to happen. And one time when I did this activity timeline for somebody, they noticed that their team that was doing SSO, we talked about it. They had an SSO solution used by a few critical apps, but not by everybody. And they wanted to, increase the messaging for that. But then when we laid it out and we put it out and said, yeah, here it is, it's a high priority for you, we discovered the resources who would build that documentation were also the same resources building all of the work for the governance solution, identity governance. As soon as you see it this way, all, sort of color coded based on the activities, you can see where there could be issues. And like I said, this is where you look at it and you say, I need to revise, right? And it's collaborative, it's collective. And Scott, I'm sure this kind of resonates with you because there's multiple people involved. It is not just an IT infosec decision, right?
That's absolutely true, and this provides something that everyone is always looking for, right? Your constituents need to know how to plan for their resources, and your infrastructure teams need to know how to plan for their resources from a technology perspective. And you obviously need to plan for how you're going to address these issues. But my peers, my constituents, always wanted to see the timeline by which they were expected to do something because that's what they were going to be affected by. It wasn't about the end users or the clients actually leveraging anything that we had in place. That's a whole different story. Right. What my constituents were concerned about was, when will you need my resources time? Exactly. When will they need to be dedicated to doing something? And so this really helps them understand when they're expected, because you can take these areas and then put pins in them and say, your area is this one, this one, this one, this one, right? And this list of activities lets them know what's coming and where they need to be involved.
Great.
Yeah, and just a quick comment, this particular example is one where it's technology transitions, and a lot of companies are in this place right now where they've got some legacy IAM things in place, maybe deeply embedded. And as you move out of that and transition, we'll talk about this a little bit more later, but you need to know kind of what's going to come out and what's going to go in and what the implications are. And we did have a question from someone, what are these colors all about? In this example, the colors are for different technology types. So the red is IGA, the green is access management, the blue is access management, the yellow is PAM. So it just makes it communicate a little better when you're trying to tell a visual story. Scott, another question came up from the attendees. Do tactical objectives belong in the roadmap or only long-term strategic? How would you answer that?
Yeah, I read that question, and that's always a struggle because tactical is relative to what you want to track and what you want to consider a milestone, right? For us, anything that we have that is an effort that is going to require collaboration, we would always put it on there. I don't care if it's tactical or strategic, whatever. If it's more than one person that's going to be responsible for being involved in actually accomplishing it, it absolutely belongs on the roadmap, because that holds people accountable, right?
Gotcha.
So I put those types of things on roadmaps.
Excellent response. And Vanita, another question I think it might be good to address just foundationally is, what's the difference between IGA and IAM? IAM, my answer is IAM is everything related to identity access. So if you look at our assessment wheel, a lot of it's technology, some of it's program governance, operations, infrastructure, things like that. That is your IAM program. IGA is specifically usually governance and compliance and provisioning versus access management and PAM. Do you have another perspective on that?
No, it's really, if you look at it, identity governance is really everything you do to manage the identity and the accesses they have. Everything the identity does, like authentication, authorization, and all of the things that identity does once they are created or onboarded or whatever it is, that is another part of identity and access management. So the whole picture is bringing an identity on board, managing the life cycle of the identity, and all that falls under identity management and governance, and whether it's privileged, et cetera, et cetera. But then everything the identity can do, for which they get, they get authenticated, authorized, credential management, all of that is also part of IAM, but it's not necessarily a part of the governance part of the identity.
Right.
That's
Okay.
my definition.
Yeah.
And then reporting and so on and so forth, it sort of wrappers the whole thing.
Yeah, good clarification. So Katie, let's jump down to 21 there, the next slide. Just some tips on road mapping, right? We've talked a lot about these already, but just some ideas on best practice. Things are going to grow and change if you're in any organization dealing with security right now. So obviously nobody saw COVID coming. So you kind of got to plan for change. And Scott, I know your organization does a lot of M&A and other activities. So how do you make sure that your stakeholders are on board with sort of flexing with the things that need to adjust along the way in a roadmap?
I'll tell you what, you have to look for the silver linings for every terrible thing that happens. and the silver lining, as strange as it sounds, and I've actually made this point to my executive team, is that because COVID forced so many people to go work from home, they were all in front of their computers. Everyone we needed was at a workstation. So anytime we needed to do something, get something, have a quick conversation, you didn't have to chase people around from building to building because they were, going to different places and different meeting rooms and conference rooms and so forth. The distractions were actually significantly reduced. So the silver lining here was accessibility to my peers, to those who were being affected, who actually needed to use and leverage the product. Even from a quality assurance perspective, you were able to gather people around and say, we need to focus on this. So that happened to be the silver lining for 2020.
Excellent. Well, Vanita, why don't you bring it home for us? There's a chunk of work, obviously, beyond the roadmap, and we want to touch on that here. You got a roadmap. Now it's time to go execute. What do you do next? So, Vanita, I'm going to.
Yeah, and that's kind of really important. So let's jump ahead a little bit, because a roadmap is great. So now you know, and I know somebody asked about change management, and I'll come back to that. But really, you've got a roadmap. You think you know what you're going to do next, right? And it could be tactical, it could be long-term, whatever it is. What's the next thing? You need to make sure that your initiatives that you've identified, you've got funding for them. And once you get your funding, and I'll come back to you, Scott, I have a question for you around that funding thing, because it's much bigger than it's, it's just a little bullet there, but it's a lot of work behind it. But let's say you got your funding and somehow magically all the money you needed you got, which is, funnily enough, never happens. Then what do? You go get your requirements, you pick your technology. Please don't do it the other way around. Don't pick your technology and now try to make it fit your roadmap, because you do that, usually you will end up with something that kind of sort of fits, but you never did any due diligence, so you kind of sort of thought it would work. So you got to be careful here. Get your requirements, figure out what you want, look at your technology options. The cloud is not a silver bullet. SaaS is not a silver bullet. Software as a service, identity as a service. You've got to look at what works for your organization. Pick a technology. Most importantly, make sure you have the skill sets or a plan for supporting that, because that's, again, very critical. You might have planned and you might have figured it all out. You put in a solution, it works for a couple of weeks, and then when it comes to support, your story starts falling flat. So make sure you think about support as part of this whole execution process. And then remember, IAM is a program, like we've been saying from the start. So it's got lots of different things happening. You've got an SSO project going on. You've got a recertification of accesses project going on. All of them are going on, and they're different work streams. Somehow make sure that you understand there's uniformity across this, because ultimately, who are you targeting? You're targeting the same set of employees, contractors, consumers, they need to see, they don't want to know this is the ping solution, this is the SailPoint interface, this is, now I go through ServiceNow, now I go through SailPoint, now I do this. You've got to make sure there's uniform consistency from an end user perspective. So all of this is around execution, and that's fine. It's great. You're running along, you're getting your work streams going. What about governance? You need to look at the risks you are bringing into the system with your new solutions. What are they? What are the things? How are you remediating them? What are the metrics? How do you measure? Because one thing to say, yep, we're going to go off and do these 1 to 3 to 5 year projects. How do you know how well they're doing? So you've got to have metrics you've identified where you say, look, I'm going to see, have my number of logged on people who've not logged in being deactivated. Has that number gone down? Am I seeing that, there's far fewer calls for password resets? Have some metrics that you can keep measuring as part of this ongoing process, right? And I think I see one thing. I know a lot of companies, and this is, somebody asked this, I believe, Katie, as part of the registration. You have a lot of tools already in place. You come up with a roadmap. What does it do to help you figure out which tools to keep and what technologies to stay with? Important. Recently, another client I've had, they had RSA for MFA. They had Symantec doing some level of MFA. And by MFA, I mean multi-factor authentication. So it's more than just authenticating the user. They have to offer a second factor for authentication, like a fingerprint or a one-time password. And then we had IBM's Identity Access Manager product. All of these provided MFA. And because they had all of these technologies, some programs had to call into one technology, other programs called in somewhere else. Performance was always an issue. So it's important. The roadmap is a good way to get started with cleaning up your technologies and deciding what you're going to use. And Scott, this comes back to your question, the thing you mentioned earlier. When you put everyone in a room and start talking, you discover there's multiple ways you're using this. The assessment shows you that. Now you can start talking about standardization. So there's execution, which is running off and doing your work streams. And there's governance, which is making sure that there are guardrails around the whole execution program. And there's measurement to show you how it's going. Katie, I know we're in the interest of time, can we go to one, there's one more thing I want to talk about. And this is about metrics and key performance indicators. I talked to you a little bit about, have measurements. So how we've done it is we built a tool at Pontus, which actually does this. So you answer some questions, you provide some numbers, because ultimately the only real way to measure success is to be able to put some numbers down and see, are you improving? Because yes, people will answer questions whichever way they choose, depending on their biases, but the numbers often tell the true story. And I'll show you what we've done through the tool. And this is kind of interesting. Katie, can you click twice? Yeah. We come up with a heat map every time you do these, do this sort of questionnaires. But most importantly, and could we go to the next one? Because I think this is important. I want to show you guys. Most importantly, you can benchmark yourself, say, in January of the year, and then come back in June and run the same numbers, and you can see whether things have improved or gone, badly. And you're looking at the different levers. In fact, it's funny, Keith, we use the same concepts, the different key areas of identity and access. You can look at them and you can decide, are things improving in a specific area? Is the program working for you? Is it not doing so well in other areas? And you can finally, Katie, next slide, please. You can score yourself. And what this tool does is, because we're techies at heart, we like to see this all in numbers. We absolutely have built weighted scoring, and it's much like Keith showed you. There are different ways to output the information. We do it through scores, which then help you identify your maturity level and we've done letter grading because I think we all understand how letter grades work. And really, whatever method you use, that's not what's important. What's important is have a roadmap and then have a way to measure how you are doing as you work through that roadmap and launch all your different initiatives.
And Benita, we're about to run out of time, but I did want to get back to Scott on the.
Yeah, I think I wanted to just get back to Scott. And Scott, I know we talked about funding. How do you go about? I just quickly said, oh yeah, just go get the funding. What are some good tips for doing that? And Katie, go to the next slide because I think that might be of use. Go ahead, Scott.
You're on mute, Scott.
Sorry, someone was mowing the lawn. I didn't want it to interrupt. So great question. And what I did was I looked at the current expenses associated with what we were doing from an identity management process perspective today. And then I looked for offsets. I said, my overall plan is to reduce my process expenses over here because I have 3 resources dedicated to this particular function over here. Let's figure out how I can get that down to 1.5 resources. I have an identity and access management product existing here. Let's sunset that product, which is what we ended up doing, and then pick up something that was newer and more agile and up with the times. And that's something that a lot of people should take into consideration, right? But most of the problems that people have with identity and access management solutions is, like we said, it's an ERP system. It takes you 3 to 5 years. You put it in and you get committed, but you stop documenting your processes. And once you stop documenting your processes, you're so anchored in it, you can't pick up and move to something else. And that is a critical issue that everyone should look to avoid. If you are putting anything in place that you cannot pick up and transition off of 5 years from now, you have made a major mistake, and you have done so much customization that you are never going to get off of there. And you'll never be able to leverage these newer solutions unless whatever you're using continues to evolve quickly enough, and you're able to leverage it for, again, end of year cost balancing and maybe moving off.
So this is what you present as part of your argument for getting funding for the different initiatives?
It's cost offsets, right? It is, I've got to address this issue, but here's how much money I can save by putting in a solution. And you've got to look at the long-term goals. If my current expenses are, let's just say, $100,000 a year in resources, and I've been doing that over the last 3 years, but I can get a solution that's going to cost me $50,000 and it's $100,000 to implement, my return on investment is very short, right? $100,000 implementation and then $50,000 a year for maintaining it is a heck of a lot better than paying $100,000 a year. In addition to the fact that humans are inherently flawed and we make mistakes, products are consistent, and I would much rather be consistently right or consistently wrong than inconsistent and having to hunt down problems every single time.
And I know there was a question, Katie, somebody had asked, where does change management fit into all this? Keith, Scott, anybody want to answer that?
I do, but I do want to see the poll results. So I'm going to ask that we skip that for a second and maybe come back to it if we have time. But Katie, let's talk about the poll results so people have a chance to see what others contributed here. And feel free to glance through those, Scott and Vanita, and if anything jumps out, let's make a comment or two. But it's interesting to see that strategic. You've got a lot of companies that are focused on strategic, but a whole lot that know they need to do it, but are just consumed by the firefighting, right? I mean, clearly a third or more are in that camp or below.
And actually, the roadmap process can be as short or as long as you want it to be. Don't go into, analysis paralysis. Absolutely not. What we're saying is at least get some directioning, and you can do that in a week. You can do that in 2 days, but at least get an idea before you launch these initiatives. So time is, because people always feel like, oh, I don't have time to go back and do this. So it's something not to, you can do it.
Question 3, it looks like people are getting a lot of good support from their stakeholders. That doesn't surprise me in that there's so much focus right now on identities after coming through 2020, right? I think people are waking up to that reality and that fact too.
Well, I think people are just getting scared. There's branding, there's credibility, there's, there's all the publicity. So it's I think what Scott said, there is a silver lining there that people are becoming more aware of what they need to be doing.
Yeah. And then on 5, it looks like people know that they need to measure things, but they're maybe not quite there yet. So good point on the metrics and the measurements, Vanita. I think that was probably important to share.
If I can say something about the measurements aspect, don't measure just for the sake of measuring. Measure because you can tie it to a specific objective. This way you're focused on measuring the right things, right? There's no sense in saying, I need 30 metrics for something.
Right.
If you have some specific objectives that you need to publish, make sure that you're focused on the 3 metrics, just 3 metrics for that specific objective, and then you can start growing and building that out.
Very good. Well, we had a lot to cover and we did a great job. And I want to thank you again, Scott, for taking the time. We really appreciate your input, your level of experience. And you've been in the trenches, long time and dealing with things in the way us as consultants don't really understand. So your perspective was very helpful here. I know that was probably to a lot of our listeners.
And we will get answers back, Katie, to those who asked questions we couldn't get to.
Yeah, we had
absolutely. And we covered we covered quite a few of them as you guys went through the discussion. So I'll make a list of who we didn't respond to and confirm that responses get sent out. Thank you everyone for attending. Thank you to the panelists. We're now out of time. So the next session in our series on identity and access management best practices will be in May. It was a pleasure having you join us for this panel discussion on how to build an identity and access management roadmap. And we look forward to having you join us again in the future.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot. See you, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you.